I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
I invite you to open up your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 5, and we'll look there in just a moment. I am certainly, along with Jeremy, delighted to see so many here this morning. I know that there have been a lot of hindrances of various forms, but glad to get to meet so many more of you this morning, and looking forward to concluding our studies together. The week has gone by rather swiftly, and I would love more time with you all and getting to know you more. I appreciate the effort that you're making in this community. Not all of the South is like Athens. Once you get, in fact, even in our state, once you get past Montgomery, which is where I used to live, the churches get farther and farther spread out. You could be 3-4 hours between congregations down that way. And so there are places, and even the place where we are was once not that way. Men came in 100 years ago and with a will to plant churches, and they did that. And we're really standing on their shoulders, the work that they did. You're trying to plant those works here. And there's nothing to say that 50, 100 years from now, another generation might not be looking at so many churches in Toronto and in the surrounding areas. And so I commend you to that work and appreciate that, and pray God for the blessings and the work here, as I know that you will do for the work that we're doing in our area. In Deuteronomy chapter 5 and Exodus chapter 20 are the two places where God records for us, Moses records for us through God's inspiration, the Ten Commandments. There back in Exodus chapter 20, they've just come to the mountain. They've exited the land of Egypt, crossed the Red Sea. They come down through the Sinai Peninsula on their way to the Promised Land, and there's this moment of pause, a year that they will be staying there in the Sinai wilderness. And in chapter 19 is when they approach the mountain. And you recall when they approached the mountain, there was thunder and lightning, there's cloud that's shaking, and they're so terrified that they say to Moses, you go talk to God, because we will die. It's an impressive scene. And then the very next chapter in Exodus chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments. That's the portion we know so well. And it really introduces the law in that way. And it goes on in chapters 21, 22, 23, sort of identifying some of the first elements of the law. We've looked at Leviticus this week, which after the construction of the tabernacle continues to delineate even the particulars of the law. Numbers would add to that, and so many particulars of the sacrifices and the feasts. But then we get to Deuteronomy, and what Deuteronomy is after the people have failed to go in and take the land because the spies gave a bad report, they wandered in the wilderness these 39 years, and they are on the very precipice of going in and taking the land. And for about 3 months, Moses would give them speeches, and the speeches would take this form. Don't forget what you've learned so far, because you'll need it. You'll need all of it when you get into the land. And so he starts all the way back at the beginning, and he starts retelling the story that they've already gone through, all the way right up to the hills of being there on the Jordan. And he doesn't tell it all in chronological order. In fact, as he's kind of rehearsed the military history, the defeat of Sihon and Og, he goes back in Deuteronomy chapter 5 to Mount Sinai. And he retells us the Ten Commandments. Not only does he retell us the Ten Commandments, he tells us the failure that followed the Ten Commandments. And then he goes on to really teach the lessons that they ought to have learned in all of that time. Well, I want to focus our attention on the first few of the Ten Commandments as they are laid out in both places, in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and in Exodus 20, and hopefully learn some things from those commands. It says in Deuteronomy 5, beginning in verse 1, Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the ordinances which I am speaking today in your hearing, that you may learn them and observe them carefully. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, with all of us alive here today. The Lord spoke to you face to face at the mountain, from the midst of the fire, while I was standing between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. He said, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." Verse 8, "You shall not make for yourselves an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, and on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments." And he goes on, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain." And then he tells them to observe the Sabbath. He tells them to honor their fathers and mother. And then we get into that second half, which is much more relational. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. And finally, you shall not covet. Well, when we look at these 10 commandments, for the most part, they are negative in nature. You shall not, right? Now, there is some positive elements, but for the most part, it is given in the negative of what you should not do. And I think sometimes people think that this is not an appropriate way. I mean, I read a lot of books about psychology and about parenting, and you shouldn't be so negative. Don't just tell your kids what they shouldn't be doing. Tell them what they ought to be doing. Well, I agree. I mean that you ought to give positive commands, and certainly God does. But I'm going to tell you what, kids need to know what not to do as well. They need to know what the boundaries are. And so God does begin. He starts his law by saying, here's what you do not do. Now, in some instances, he gives both the affirmative and the negative. And there are occasions when God does this all in one context. And when he does, you need to pay attention. What he's doing there, it's a way to make what Tom Holly calls a biblical superlative. When God says it will be this way and it will not be this way, it's like a guarantee. So an example would be in Luke chapter 1 when Gabriel appears to Zacharias there in the temple to tell him about the birth of John the Baptist. He doesn't believe Gabriel, and he says, "What sign?" And Gabriel's very angry with him. And so he tells him, you will be mute and you will not speak, right? And so in essence, you'd say, well, those are the same thing, right? You will be mute and you will not speak. What he's saying is, I guarantee you, it ain't going to happen. This is a promise to you. And so when God gives us both ends of that, you see that a lot in the Psalms. You see that kind of parallelism as you go through the Psalms. It's here at least once in the 10 Commandments. And so as you look, let's go back to the Exodus account now. Over in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, as he gets into the Sabbath in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That's an affirmative. It's one of the few affirmatives here. In fact, of two, honor your father and mother is the other. But remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath day to the Lord. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. So there's the affirmative. Remember the Sabbath. Don't do any work. And so he's given both ends of that command. So there's one example where he does give us both the affirmative and the negative all there in the same context. But can I suggest to you that beyond that, when God says, don't do this, he is already implying what he wants you to be doing in the affirmative. In Romans chapter 13, and there in verse 8 beginning, the Apostle Paul makes reference back to most of the second half of the Ten Commandments. He says there beginning in verse 8, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, and therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. So he is starting with a restrictive command. Don't do this, but the implication is I'm restraining you from harm to your neighbor. What you ought to take from that is actually do good to your neighbor, right? Move in the opposite direction of what I'm telling you not to do. As parents, we might communicate this way to our children sometimes. So, God says, do not murder. Well, there are times when my mother, maybe she was leaving the house, and she might say, and maybe not quite as seriously as God was saying, she would say, don't kill each other, right? Now, what she'd really prefer was that we treat each other with kindness, is that we actually love and provide and care for each other. But I tell you what, she'd be really glad if we started with not killing each other. And in fact, I can remember distinctly my mom, she's going to lay down for a nap. And she might say, I don't want to hear anything, so nobody hits anybody, nobody draws any blood, just I need 10 minutes of peace. And again, much preferred would have been actually treat each other with kindness. It's really what she wanted in the long run. But she would settle with no violence, at least to start with. I think that's what Jesus does with these commands over in Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, and there beginning in verse 21, we made reference to this earlier in our series, where Jesus takes several of the commands from the law and kind of digs down into them. But you notice that he says there, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, but whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. And Jesus begins to back away from that command. I don't mean back away and to lessen it, but back away, like starts moving in the other direction. Here's the things that you really ought to have gotten from that command not to murder. It go all the way down to, we talked about this, I just referenced this the other day, but an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Their mindset about that was just on the surface. If somebody hits your eye, you take their eye. And if somebody takes your tooth, you take their tooth. And I really think, as you look at that back in its context, and as Jesus speaks about it here, is God is not demanding that you take an eye. He's not demanding you take a tooth. But rather, he is restricting and saying, if someone takes an eye from you, you can take no more than an eye from them. Because what is the likely scenario? In fact, what is the historical scenario? You take an eye from me, then I will take two from you. And then you will take a life from me. And now we have a war. And that's how wars start, is people do not restrain themselves to the just recompense that they are due. So they've taken that and they come into this Roman society and they are eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth in all the wrong ways. And he said, and so here Roman soldiers comes up to them and he slaps them across the face. And what is your response? Well, I must take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And he says, not so. Not so. You could take the insult. That could also be a possibility. And in fact, you will be in a better position by doing that, because what will taking the slap for slap to the Roman soldier get you? a loss of life. He's not going to practice the restraint of God. So by rethinking and thinking more deeply about that law, they would keep themselves out of a lot of trouble. Not only that, but they would learn some great spiritual lessons. Finally, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. He comes down to that. Notice what they had done there. You shall love your neighbor, but then they had added to it, you shall hate your enemy. God gives them the first instruction, Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18. He says nothing of the second. So what they heard was love your neighbor, and they said, well, he didn't say anything about enemies. And of course, as we look over at the story of the Good Samaritan, we find that God expands that concept of neighbor and helps show them that the Samaritan who they thought was so wicked was their neighbor, in so much as he treated them as his neighbor. They didn't offer the return there. But in all of that, what we're learning is that when God says don't do this, he implies do this. I think sometimes when we get into a mentality of what God restricts, we, like the Pharisees, we close in on that command and we make it so small. So I can't do that. But I tell you what, all around it, I could do this, and it wouldn't be exactly that. It might be close, but it's not that. Well, you've missed it. And you've missed it like the Pharisees missed it. And so what God says, when he says stay away from this, it means turn your back on it. Walk the other direction. What does that look like? Well, love in each of these cases is what it looks like. So take that back then to the first of these commandments. When we look there in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 3 once again. And you might just place a marker there, as that's where we'll be coming back to, as well as Deuteronomy chapter 5. In Exodus chapter 20, again, when he says in that particular place, you shall have no other gods before me. You don't worship any other gods. What is he saying? Love me. Don't make any references of worship. Don't make any images that you might worship. Worship me. Put me first. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 5, notice the way it's followed up. Deuteronomy chapter 5, where the Ten Commandments are given, and then he tells them of their failure following the Ten Commandments. Subsequently in verse 22 beginning, he says, here's what you did. You forsook, but I stood up for you, and the Lord did not destroy you. We come down into chapter 6 as Moses continues this speech. He says, this is the commandment, the statutes, and the judgments which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, that you might do them in the land which you are going to possess it. So I've given you the commands. I'm repeating to you the commands, and the Lord has given these to you for this reason, that you might keep all these statutes, he says in verse 2. Come then down to verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So here's Jesus when he is asked, what are the great commandments? Well, the greatest is right there. And it follows on those 10 commandments. And I believe that just as the second half is teaching love your neighbor, that's what Paul says, the first half is teaching you shall love the Lord your God. And so these are the two great commandments that encompass the whole of the 10 commandments. And of course, as Jesus says, the whole law and the prophets. Everything hangs on these two commands. So when he says don't worship any other gods, he says love me exclusively, above and beyond any other god. Well, digging into that just a little bit more. When he says no other gods before me. Now that literally translated would be no other gods before my face. Okay? In front of me. In my presence, we might say. Same phrase is found back in Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 8. You remember back there in the garden, after Adam and Eve have both partaken of the fruit that was forbidden, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It says in verse 8 that they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord. That is, from before his face, from before the face of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. So they hid themselves from his presence. That's what God is saying. No other gods in my presence. So the idea is not, when he says have no other gods before me, he doesn't mean don't put any gods above me in the chain of gods, right? Don't make a list and make sure I'm at the top. That's no good. You know, Zeus was at the top of the pantheon. God doesn't want to be at the top of the pantheon. He doesn't want there to be a pantheon. It's just him. If I told my wife, this, in thinking about our relationships and the singularity of our relationships, our relationship with God is singular. Our relationships with our spouses are singular. If I came home and I told my wife, if she asked me, she says, I heard you tell this woman over here that you love her. What do you mean by that? And I say, don't worry. She's number 3 on my list. You're number 1. I think my wife would say, first of all, how long is this list? Second of all, who's number 2? And how does this relate to me? You see, if I have a list of favorite people, she wants a list where her name is the only name. And anything I think about anybody else, that belongs in a whole different list entirely. In God's case, he says, nobody else in my presence. Where's his presence? It's everywhere. And so there's nothing that is in competition. We think of no other thing in the same way we think about God, just in the same way that I think about no other woman in the same way that I think about my wife. Even if I were to think about another woman in the same way at a lesser level, it would be insufficient. She stands alone. God stands alone in that way. And so it is in this way, in fact, that I think Jesus, what he means when he says, you shall hate father and mother. You don't even think of them the same way. There's no comparison in our relationship to God. Well, as you go on from that and you look at Israel's history, you come to Exodus chapter 32, as I said, that he also rehearses there in Deuteronomy chapter 5. There in chapter 32, it is fascinating to note the nature of their sin there and its connection to the 10 Commandments. It says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, come and make us a God who will go before us, that is, before our faces. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And so Aaron said to them, tear off the gold rings which are in your ears, the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them up to me. The idea that not only that they broke God's command, they literally broke the first one and the second one. And so the ink is not dry. God has not even finished delivering the law. But here the people in chapter 24 have said, oh, we will do it. Whatever you say, we will fulfill your commands. It's been ratified with the blood. But the ink is not dry, and they've broken the very first command. Maybe that helps us understand the wrath of God in response. You just said you would do it. And you didn't just break the command. You started at the top of the list. And it's like they're going to work their way down. And in fact, they would. It's almost methodical that the Israelites would go and break every command that they could possibly break. But he shows at that very first breaking of the command that he is better than they are. Because they break it, he has every right to destroy them. They've broken the covenant that he has made with them. But he shows that he is kind, he is merciful. In chapter 34, that is the very way he defines himself. That he is a God of kindness, everlasting kindness, love, and mercy. And so their relationship with God begins not just on law, but on mercy. The whole relationship of Israel and God is founded on that. But it's not just that they broke the command, that they put up an idol and they worship something else, and it's sort of a mechanical breaking, like a technical breaking of the law. It's not, God is not looking and going, I know you didn't mean to, it was kind of an accident. You sort of fell into this. That's what Aaron says. I put the gold in the fire and calf jumped out. Who knew? That's not what's happening, of course. And it's never the problem when it comes to idolatry. The problem has always been a problem of the heart. In Ezekiel chapter 14 and in verse 3, the problem of idolatry has always been a heart problem. Son of man, God says in Ezekiel 14:3, Son of man, these men have set up their idols in their hearts and have put right before their faces the stumbling block of their iniquity. Should I be consulted by them at all? And so he here at a time in Ezekiel when people are still putting up idols, literal idols. That's not as common today. There's still people who do. I've seen many idols in my travels, literal ones that have been set up in people's yards and so forth. But here, even at a time when that's rampant, he says the issue is they've set the idols up in their hearts. They really mean it. And they love those things. And they worship them. And so their relationship with me has been broken. Well, at a time where maybe those things are not as common, we want to recognize that idolatry is the pervasive problem that it has always been. Idolatry is when you bring something else into the presence of God. That is, you bring something into God's presence that is a competitor. There should be no competitors. Over in Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. And there, in verse 5, Paul writes, Therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil, desire, and greed, or covetousness, which amounts to idolatry. That connection between idolatry and covetousness, you note that those are the bookends of the Ten Commandments. He starts with, don't worship any other gods, idolatry. And then he ends with, don't covet, which I think is, well, I don't just think it is, Paul says, is a form of idolatry. When we covet something, we want something, and we want that more than we want God. That is the very roots, that's the very foundation of breaking our relationship with God. In Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 6, it says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was delightful to the eye, and the tree was desirable to make one wise. You see the covetousness there? She wants what's over there that is not hers to have, but she took from it its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Here it is, God has said you can have me and life and everything that a relationship with me offers. And she sees that tree and goes, yeah, but that looks pretty good too. Okay, that's your choice. And you lose what God has to offer because you put something else on the level with him. Back in Psalm 19, and verse 10, this is a psalm that we sing from time to time. We sang it this week. Beginning of verse 7, the law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. Verse 10 is that verse that we use as the chorus. It says, they are more desirable than gold, yes, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the drippings of the honeycomb. That's the way that we have to look at God. All the best things that this life has to offer, the gold and the pleasures of honey, as it uses there as a representation of pleasure, better than all of that. It's sweeter and more precious than all of that. And so we would let gold and we would let honey and every other pleasant thing in this world fall by the wayside and hold in higher value and higher regard God and his blessings. It's hard. I think this is one of the most difficult aspects of Christianity today because we live in a time and in place of tremendous prosperity. even if we are not experiencing its greatest heights, at its lowest levels, we're still experiencing pleasures the world has hardly known, and still much of the world hardly knows. And so it calls to us, and it pulls on us. And we think, here is God, and here are all these things, and we figure out ways to say, well, I'm not just setting God to the side. That's not the question. It's not are you setting him to the side. Incidentally, in Exodus chapter 32, they equate that calf with God. Here is the God. It's Jehovah. They call him Yahweh. So they don't set him to the side. This is the God that brought us up out of that land of Egypt. They just turn him into something else. It's not good enough to just say that I'll continue to make time for God. What he is saying is, I will be the only thing. And so, if you are just simply making room for God among the other gods in your life, he won't have it. He won't be co-equal. He will be on a throne all to himself. And in that light, understand that it is not simply wicked things then that can get in the way. As I referenced Luke chapter 14 there in verse 26, when Jesus is talking about this hatred. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and his mother and his wife and his children and his brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. What Jesus is saying is family can be your God. And if it is, I won't share. You know, in his law, he says if your family member comes to you enticing you to follow idols, what you ought to do is destroy them. That is strong language. I will not share with anyone, not even your spouse, not your parents, not your children. Innumerable are the souls that have been lost because of people loving someone, even people they ought to love, more than they love God. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 13, as I was referencing, Deuteronomy chapter 13, beginning in verse 6, if your brother, your mother's son, your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is as your own soul, entice you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have known, of the gods of the peoples who are around you, near you or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other, you shall not yield to him or listen to him, and your eye shall not pity him. You shall not, nor shall you spare or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of all the people. Your best friend comes and he says, hey, listen, I've heard about these gods of the Philistines, and you won't believe all the stuff that they do in worship to their God. You got to try this out. And your heart's broken. And he says, it's not enough for you to look at him and say, I can't go with you. You got to cast the first stone. That is a level of devotion that I think we do not contemplate nearly enough. Now, obviously, he doesn't call us to stone our friends. But I tell you what he does. He calls us to stop calling them friends. We cannot. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, we don't have anything in common anymore. We cannot be yoked together if you're going and worshiping the gods of this world. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and beginning in verse 29. It says, but this I say, brethren, the time has been shortened, so that from now on those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full usage of it. For the form of this world is passing away. Listen to that. Here's Paul, who has preached even in this passage, but in Ephesians chapter 5, who says husbands ought to be to their wives like Christ to the church. willing to sacrifice himself. But here he says it should be that those who have wives should be as though they had none. And goes on that people who are experiencing emotion, who weep, should be as those who do not weep, and rejoice as those who do not rejoice. Here's what I think Paul is saying is, we are not wrapped up in anything in this world like the rest of the people are. So, love, romantic love, is presented in this world as the highest ideal. Nothing is better than love, is it? God says, I'm better than that. And so when I say to people that I love God more than my wife, the world says, how can that be? I've got one thing better than my wife in this world, and it's him. Nothing else. But he is. And he's so much greater that it might look to you that my wife's not that important to me. Because when I set God aside, I would leave her and everything for him. Even she is someone I would walk away from for him. A fellow told me one time, look, you got to support your family. He was supporting his brother in wickedness. And he said, you got to stand by your family. I said, you do not. You have to stand by God. In this, I wouldn't just say this, whatever it is. I love sports. I'm a big sports fan. I haven't talked about it this week because none of you people care about college football. But I do, and I love it. And I love college basketball, and I like baseball. But my team's out, so is yours, so we're not talking about that either. But there are people who build their lives on it. It means, and they'll say, it means everything to me. And you might look at me on a Saturday, and you might see me get pretty excited and think, that's pretty important. And it is. Probably more important than it should be. But I'll tell you what. I would never go there on a Lord's Day and worship that idol instead of this God. I would not just on the Lord's Day, I would never sit in front of the television watching that instead of coming to an opportunity to study the Bible with God's people. And I'll tell you this too. You may not have rivalries like we have. I don't know how bad you hate other teams. There are teams we just cannot stand. So for me, I like Auburn and Alabama. You may have heard the Roll Tide. Okay? That's filthy language in my house. We don't say Roll Tide. I was talking to somebody one day about this, and he was like, you're so involved. I said, I tell you what, if I thought saying Roll Tide would get me an opportunity to study the Bible with somebody, man, I'll wear red and white and I'll sing their fight song. I don't care. I care about this more than all of that. And so that's what he means when he says nothing else comes close. Well, a couple of more things, and the lesson will be yours. The first commandment restricts who we can worship. The second commandment restricts how we can worship. So in the first place, you don't worship anything else, anyone else but me. And in the second place, don't make any images. Well, I want to take that language of image and likeness that we see in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4. There, that command of no graven image, some of your translations will say. He says, not only that you shall make no image, but nothing in the likeness of what is in heaven above or in the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. Well, in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, there's a passage that I think you're probably familiar with. It says, then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. These are the word image is not the same Hebrew word, but there is some overlap in the language here. But notice he uses this language in Exodus chapter 20. Don't make an image, don't make any likeness. Here in chapter 1 and verse 26, God says, you are in my image and you are my likeness. People like to have visual aids. We like to have something to look at. And when we're worshiping, history shows us that people like to make something to look at when they're worshiping. God says, don't make an image of me. In chapter 1 and verse 26 of Genesis, he says, you are supposed to be the image of me. We're supposed to be the thing that people can see. That's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 when he points to us and he says, we're supposed to reflect God's glory. People are supposed to see us and see God through us. But we are always people who would rather point over somewhere else and say, that's what you're supposed to worship. We don't like to have the responsibility to be the reflection, to be the image and the likeness of God. Paul uses that language in Romans chapter 1 and verse 22, and we see the contrasting of the language there in the book of Romans. In Romans chapter 1 and in verse 22, it says, professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. But notice over in chapter 8 and verse 29, Paul says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. Here are people who gave up God and began to form images that were either equal or even demotions. They're looking down to worship into the creation. He says, but you were predestined not to be conformed to this world, but be conformed to the image of his Son. We're supposed to make ourselves reflections. Jesus, of course, is the perfect fulfillment, and the final fulfillment of this, as we've been talking about all week. Over in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Over in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving so that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. What Jesus says, if you see me, you see the Father. That's supposed to be what we're trying to do. Matthew chapter 5, when we're lights of the world, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. What they should say is, that's what God looks like. It's the opposite of what the Jews were doing. We already talked about it in Romans chapter 2. Because of their deeds, people blasphemed God. They looked at them and said, I don't want any part of the God that you serve. Now, it may be that people don't want any part of the God we serve. But let it not be because we are poor reflections of it. If they don't want to serve the God, let it be because they see him for what he truly is in us. And if they don't want that, that's fine. But let it not be because we've perverted it. Or worse yet, we've made a perverse image over here that is even an even greater perversion of it. Well, that's a lot of time to talk about essentially two commands. But I think it's what Jesus wants us to do with the commands. I think he wants us to set them in our hearts, to meditate on them, to contemplate the depth of them, and not just say, well, I'm not bound down to anything. Check, got that one. No, you don't. That's not enough. You love him with all your heart, all your strength, your soul, your mind. And that is what he wants from us.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord.